Number 1. Samuel Little. Imagine walking into a police interrogation room and sitting across from a man who calmly tells you he's killed 93 people. Not 10, not 20, 93. And then imagine him describing each victim in such vivid detail that investigators realize, with a sinking feeling, that he's telling the truth. Samuel Little didn't look like what most people imagine when they think of America's deadliest criminal. By the time authorities truly understood what they were dealing with, he was an elderly man with diabetes, using a wheelchair, his once powerful boxer's frame diminished by age and illness. But for more than 3 decades, this soft-spoken drifter had moved across the country like a shadow, leaving behind a trail of victims that law enforcement didn't even know existed. Born Samuel McDowell in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, Little's early life was marked by instability. Raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, he dropped out of high school and drifted into a life of petty crime, shoplifting, fraud, breaking, and entering. He spent time in prison, in and out, again and again. To the system, he was just another repeat offender, nothing particularly alarming. He wasn't seen as dangerous in the way that would make investigators connect the dots later. He was just a nuisance, a career criminal who couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. But beneath that unremarkable criminal record was something far darker. Between 1970 and 2005, Little traveled constantly. Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Ohio, and California. He had no permanent address, no stable relationships, no real ties to anyone. He worked odd jobs when he needed money, boxed occasionally under different names, and kept moving. And as he moved, women disappeared. His victims were almost always vulnerable. Women struggling with addiction, women engaged in survival work on the streets, women society had largely forgotten. He would approach them with charm, offer them a ride or the promise of drugs or money. Once they were alone with him, he would strike. Little preferred to strangle his victims, using a method he described with chilling precision, applying pressure until they lost consciousness, then waiting, watching them revive slightly, and applying pressure again. He called it his way. He rarely used weapons. He didn't need to. His hands were enough. What made Little so difficult to catch was his choice of victims and his method. Because he rarely caused obvious trauma beyond strangulation, and because many of his victims were women whose disappearances weren't immediately investigated with urgency, their deaths were often classified as overdoses, accidents, or natural causes. Some bodies were never found at all. Little would dump them in alleys, dumpsters, abandoned buildings, places where they might not be discovered for days or weeks, if ever. And then he would move on to the next city, the next state, the next victim. He was arrested multiple times over the years for assault, for attacks on women that didn't end in death. In 1982, he was charged in the killing of a woman in Mississippi, but the grand jury didn't indict him. In 1984, he was charged with the murder of a woman in San Diego, but the case fell apart, and he walked free. Each time, he slipped through the system. Each time, he kept going. It wasn't until 2012 that the walls truly began to close in. Little was arrested in a Kentucky homeless shelter on a drug charge, and his DNA was entered into the national database. That DNA matched evidence from 3 unsolved cases in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. The murders of Carol Eileen Alford, Audrey Nelson, and Guadalupe Apodaca. Investigators brought him back to California, and in 2014, he was convicted of all 3 killings and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But even then, no one knew the full scope of what he'd done. In 2018, a Texas Ranger named James Holland sat down with Little in his California prison cell and began a series of interviews that would rewrite the history of serial crime in America. Holland didn't interrogate him harshly. He didn't threaten or pressure. He just listened. And Samuel Little, perhaps sensing his own mortality or simply wanting someone to know, began to talk. He confessed to killing after killing, city after city, year after year. He drew sketches of his victims from memory, women he'd encountered decades earlier, their faces rendered in surprising detail. He remembered what they wore, where he picked them up, the color of their hair, the sound of their voices. For investigators, it was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. Many of the cases he described had never been classified as homicides. Some of the victims had never been reported missing. The FBI launched a massive effort to verify his confessions, cross-referencing his claims with unsolved cases, unidentified remains, and missing persons reports from across the country. By 2019, they had confirmed more than 50 of his confessions. By the time of his death, that number had climbed even higher. The FBI officially named Samuel Little the most prolific serial killer in United States history. He was never charged with most of the murders he confessed to. He was already serving life without parole, and many jurisdictions simply didn't have the resources or evidence to pursue additional prosecutions. In December 2020, at the age of 80, Samuel Little passed away in a California hospital while still in custody. What remains haunting about Samuel Little isn't just the staggering number of lives he took. It's how long he was able to do it undetected, how many chances the system had to stop him and didn't, and how many of his victims were forgotten long before he ever confessed. Even now, some of the women he described in his confessions remain unidentified. Their families may never know what happened to them. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling part of all, that a man could take 93 lives and, for most of his own life, no one even noticed. Number 2. Joseph James DeAngelo. For 40 years, he was a ghost, a phantom who terrorized California in the darkness, leaving behind shattered lives and a trail of unsolved crimes that seemed impossible to connect. He had dozens of names: the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, the Diamond Knot Killer. But when investigators finally learned his real name in 2018, it wasn't through traditional detective work or a lucky break. It was through a family tree that led them to a quiet cul-de-sac in a Sacramento suburb, where a 72-year-old former police officer was living out his retirement in plain sight. Joseph James DeAngelo was born in 1945 in Bath, New York, the son of a military family. His father served in the Air Force, which meant the family moved frequently during his childhood. By all accounts, he seemed unremarkable, a quiet kid who grew into a young man with ambitions of serving his country. He enlisted in the Navy in 1964 and was stationed in Vietnam during the war. When he returned, he attended college, earned a degree in criminal justice, and joined the police force. First, he worked as a police officer in Exeter, a small town in California's Central Valley, from 1973 to 1976. Then he moved to the Auburn Police Department, where he worked until 1979. To his colleagues, he was competent, if occasionally difficult. To his neighbors, he was just another guy. Married, seemingly stable, living a normal suburban life. No one suspected that behind this ordinary facade was someone who was already deep into a campaign of terror that would span more than a decade. It started in the early 1970s in Visalia, California, where a prowler began breaking into homes, ransacking them, stealing small items, and occasionally escalating to violence. The community nicknamed him the Visalia Ransacker. Over 100 burglaries were attributed to him, and in 1975, he was interrupted during a break-in by a journalist named Claude Snelling, who confronted him while trying to kidnap Snelling's daughter. The intruder shot and killed Snelling, then disappeared into the night. That murder went unsolved for decades. Then, in 1976, the East Area Rapist emerged in Sacramento. This offender was meticulous, patient, and terrifyingly methodical. He would stalk neighborhoods for weeks, studying his victims' routines, learning which houses had single women or couples, which had dogs, which had unlocked gates. He would break in during the night, wearing a mask, armed with a flashlight and a weapon. He would wake his victims, bind them with shoelaces he brought with him, and commit brutal attacks that left survivors traumatized for life. If there was a man in the home, he would place dishes on the man's back and threaten to kill everyone if he heard the dishes fall. Between 1976 and 1979, he attacked at least 50 times across Sacramento, Contra Costa, and the East Bay. Witnesses described him as young, athletic, possibly in his 20s or early 30s. He had a distinctive high-pitched voice that many victims remembered. He would sometimes sob or whisper to himself during attacks, saying things like, "I hate you," or calling out for his mother. These bizarre behaviors only added to the terror. Then suddenly, the East Area Rapist stopped. Or rather, he evolved. In 1979, the attack shifted south to Southern California, and the violence escalated. The same offender, or someone with an eerily similar pattern, began breaking into homes in Goleta, Ventura, and Orange County. But now, he was killing. The first victims were a young couple, bludgeoned to death in their home. Then another couple. Then another. The murders continued through 1986, with 10 confirmed victims. Investigators in Southern California called him the original Night Stalker, unaware that he was the same person who had terrorized Northern California years earlier. And then, just as mysteriously as it all began, it stopped. 1986 came and went. No more attacks, no more murders. It was as if he had vanished. For decades, the cases remained unsolved. Investigators across California worked independently, not realizing until DNA technology advanced that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. In 2001, DNA evidence finally linked the Northern and Southern California crimes, and the term Golden State Killer was coined to describe this single, elusive offender. But even with DNA evidence, there were no matches in any criminal database. The case went cold again. Then came a breakthrough that would change criminal investigations forever. In 2018, investigators working with a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GeneMatch, a public genealogy website where people upload their DNA data to find relatives. They weren't looking for an exact match. They were looking for distant relatives who shared enough DNA to build a family tree. And it worked. Through painstaking genealogical research, they identified a branch of a family tree that led them to Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. Investigators began surveillance. They collected DNA samples from items he discarded in public: a tissue, a car door handle. The DNA matched. On April 24, 2018, 72-year-old Joseph DeAngelo was arrested outside his home. Neighbors were stunned. His ex-wife, who had divorced him in 1991, later said she wasn't entirely surprised. He had been verbally abusive and had a temper. But even she hadn't imagined this. His daughters, who had grown up believing their father was just a difficult man, now had to reckon with the truth. The legal process that followed was complicated by DeAngelo's age and health, as well as the sheer number of charges. Prosecutors in multiple counties wanted justice for their victims. In June 2020, DeAngelo stood before a court and pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and dozens of related charges, including kidnapping and robbery. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. During the sentencing hearings, which stretched over several days, survivors and family members of victims addressed DeAngelo directly. They spoke of nightmares that lasted decades, of lives forever altered, of loved ones who never got justice. DeAngelo, frail and sitting in a wheelchair, showed little emotion. In August 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with 11 consecutive life sentences to ensure he would never walk free. Today, Joseph James DeAngelo remains incarcerated in California. He is in his late 70s now, and barring a reversal of his conviction, he will die in prison. But the questions linger. How did a police officer, someone trained to catch criminals, commit these crimes for so long without being caught? How many more victims might there be that were never connected to him? And what does it say about the systems we rely on for safety that one of the most prolific offenders in American history wore a badge while he terrorized entire communities? The Golden State Killer is no longer a mystery, but the shadow he cast over California and the lives he destroyed will never fully disappear. Number 3. Rex Heuermann. The stretch of Ocean Parkway along Gilgo Beach is desolate in winter. The sand is gray, the waves relentless, and the scrub brush that lines the roadway stands brittle and brown against the cold Atlantic wind. It's the kind of place people drive past without looking twice. And that's exactly why, for more than a decade, it became a dumping ground for bodies that no one was supposed to find. In December 2010, a police officer training with a cadaver dog was searching for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert, who had disappeared months earlier after making a frantic call to authorities from the area. The officer didn't find Shannon that day. Instead, the dog led him to 4 other bodies, wrapped in burlap and hidden in the brush along the isolated highway. All 4 were women. All 4 had advertised services online, and all 4 had been murdered. The discovery sent shockwaves through Long Island. As investigators expanded their search over the following months, they found even more remains, 10 sets in total, scattered along a 10-mile stretch of coastline. Some of the victims were identified quickly. Others remained nameless for years. The cases were linked by location and method, but despite massive public attention and years of investigation, no arrests were made. The killer, whoever he was, had been careful. He left little evidence. He knew the area, and he seemed to vanish into the ordinary fabric of suburban life. Rex Heuermann was born in 1963 and grew up on Long Island. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, with a heavy build and a booming voice. He wasn't the type of person who blended into a crowd, but somehow, for decades, he managed to hide in plain sight. He studied architecture, started his own firm in Manhattan, and worked on projects throughout New York City. His office was located in Midtown, just a short walk from some of the most famous buildings in the world. He lived in Massapequa Park, a middle-class community on Long Island, in a house that neighbors described as cluttered and run down, with overgrown weeds and peeling paint. He was married and had 2 children. To those who knew him casually, he seemed like a typical suburban father. A little odd, maybe, a little unkempt, but nothing that raised serious alarm. He drove an older model Chevrolet Avalanche, a green pickup truck that would later become a key piece of evidence. He went to work, came home, lived what appeared to be a quiet, unremarkable life. But investigators working the Gilgo Beach case never stopped looking. Even as years passed and the trail seemed to go cold, a task force continued to review evidence, re-interview witnesses, and analyze phone records and digital data from the time of the murders. They were looking for patterns, anything that might connect the victims to a single individual. One of the breakthroughs came from burner phones. Several of the victims had been contacted by someone using prepaid, untraceable cell phones in the days before they disappeared. Investigators were able to track the locations where those phones had been used, and over time, a pattern emerged. The phones were activated in areas near Massapequa. They were used to contact victims in Manhattan, and they were discarded shortly after the women vanished. Investigators also had DNA evidence recovered from the remains and from items found at some of the crime scenes. But for years, they had no one to match it to. That changed when advancements in genetic genealogy, the same technique used to catch the Golden State Killer, allowed them to build a family tree from DNA left at the scenes. The tree pointed them toward a specific family on Long Island. Surveillance began. Investigators watched Rex Heuermann for months, tracking his movements, documenting his routines, and waiting for an opportunity to obtain a confirmed DNA sample. In early 2023, they got it. Heuermann discarded a pizza box in a trash can in Manhattan. DNA from that box was tested and matched DNA found on the victims. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Midtown Manhattan, just outside his architectural office. He was charged with multiple counts of murder in connection with the deaths of 3 women, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, all of whom had been found along Gilgo Beach. He was also named as the prime suspect in the death of a 4th woman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. The arrest stunned Long Island. News crews descended on his home in Massapequa Park, where investigators spent days searching the property, removing hundreds of items as evidence. Neighbors who had lived next to him for years struggled to reconcile the man they knew, gruff, awkward, but seemingly harmless, with the horrifying accusations. Heuermann's wife filed for divorce almost immediately. She and their children were not implicated in any way, and investigators have stated publicly that they believe the family had no knowledge of his alleged crimes. In interviews, his wife described him as controlling and distant, but said she never imagined he could be capable of violence. The legal case against Heuermann is built on a combination of DNA evidence, cell phone records, witness statements, and forensic analysis. Prosecutors allege that he used his architectural work as cover, traveling into Manhattan regularly and using the anonymity of the city to contact victims online. He would arrange meetings, pick them up in his truck, and bring them back to Long Island, where he would kill them and dispose of their bodies along the isolated stretch of Ocean Parkway. The burlap he used to wrap the bodies is believed to have come from his home or property. In addition to the initial charges, investigators have continued to examine whether Heuermann may be connected to other unsolved cases. Some of the additional remains found along Gilgo Beach have not yet been definitively linked to him, and authorities are exploring whether his crimes may extend beyond Long Island. Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense attorneys have argued that the evidence is circumstantial, and that DNA evidence alone is not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As of now, he remains in custody, held without bail, awaiting trial. The case is still unfolding. New evidence continues to emerge, and investigators have indicated that additional charges may be filed as the investigation progresses. The trial, when it happens, is expected to be one of the most closely watched in recent New York history. For the families of the victims, the arrest brought a mix of relief and anguish. After more than a decade of waiting, they finally had a name, a face, someone to hold accountable. But it also meant confronting the reality of what happened to their loved ones, women who were vulnerable, who were failed by a system that didn't prioritize their disappearances, and who were discarded like they didn't matter. The Gilgo Beach case is a reminder that some predators live among us, hidden behind ordinary lives and mundane routines. Rex Heuermann wasn't a drifter or a transient. He was a homeowner, a businessman, a father. He lived in a community, worked in a city, and moved through the world like anyone else. And for more than a decade, while investigators searched for answers, he was right there, just another face in the crowd, waiting to be seen. Number 4. Dennis Rader. A letter arrived at a Wichita television station in March 2004, nearly 25 years after the last known communication from a killer who had once held an entire city hostage with fear. Inside the envelope was a photocopy of a driver's license belonging to a murdered woman, along with photographs of her body and 3 hand-drawn images depicting a bound woman in various stages of distress. At the bottom of one page, written in the same meticulous block letters that investigators remembered from decades earlier, were the words, "BTK is back, BTK, bind, torture, kill," the name he had given himself in the 1970s when he first announced his crimes to the world. And now, after years of silence, he was reaching out again. Not because he had to, but because he wanted the attention. He wanted to be remembered, and that need for recognition would ultimately be his undoing. Dennis Lynn Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and grew up in Wichita. He was the oldest of 4 sons in a working-class family. By all outward appearances, he was ordinary, quiet, polite, maybe a little awkward, but nothing that set off alarm bells. He attended local schools, served briefly in the Air Force, and returned to Wichita to settle into what seemed like a conventional life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, and together they had 2 children. He worked various jobs, installing security alarms, working for the local government as a compliance officer. He was active in his Lutheran church, serving as a congregation president for years. He was a Cub Scout leader. He mowed his lawn. He attended neighborhood meetings. He seemed, to everyone around him, like the epitome of a stable, unremarkable suburban man. But beneath that carefully maintained facade was something else entirely. From a young age, Rader had violent fantasies. He was drawn to images of bondage, to the idea of control and domination. He would later describe a compulsion he called Factor X, an internal force he claimed drove him to kill. He spent years planning, fantasizing, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came on January 15th, 1974. Rader broke into the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and two of their children, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine, were home that morning. Rader had been stalking the family, watching their routines. He cut the phone line, entered through the back door, and held them at gunpoint. He told them he was a wanted fugitive who needed their car and money. But that was a lie. He had come to kill. He bound the family members and strangled them one by one. The children watched as their parents were taken from them. The horror of what happened in that house is almost unbearable to imagine. When it was over, Rader left the scene, taking small personal items as trophies. The crime shocked Wichita. 4 people from the same family, killed in their own home in broad daylight. There were no clear suspects, no obvious motive, and very little physical evidence. For months, the case remained unsolved. Then, in October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. It directed investigators to a book in the Wichita Public Library, where they found another letter hidden inside. This one described the Otero murders in chilling detail and claimed responsibility. It was signed with the initials BTK, explaining what the letter stood for. The killer wanted credit. He wanted people to know what he had done. Over the next few years, Rader struck again and again. In April 1974, he broke into the home of a young woman named Catherine Bright, stabbing and shooting her. She survived long enough to describe her attacker, but later died from her injuries. Her brother, who had been with her, was also shot, but survived. In March 1977, Rader killed Shirley Vian, a mother of 3, strangling her in her own home while her children were locked in a closet. In December of that year, he broke into the home of Nancy Fox and strangled her in her bed. After leaving the scene, he called the police from a payphone and calmly told them where to find her body. Between attacks, Rader sent letters and poems to newspapers and television stations, taunting police and demanding media coverage. He seemed to crave the notoriety, the sense of power that came from knowing he was outsmarting everyone. He even suggested names for himself and criticized the media when they didn't use them. The city of Wichita lived in fear. Women changed their routines, installed new locks, slept with weapons nearby. Parents warned their children. Neighborhoods organized watch groups. But BTK remained invisible. Then, in 1979, after the murder of Nancy Fox, the letters stopped. The killings stopped. For years, nothing. Investigators continued to work the case, but leads dried up. The task force was eventually scaled back. The city began to move on, though the fear never fully disappeared. In 1985 and 1986, Rader killed twice more, Maureen Hedge, strangled in her home, and Dolores Davis, abducted and killed, her body left under a bridge. But even after these murders, he didn't communicate. He went silent again, blending back into his life. He went to work, attended church, coached his son's baseball team, enforced city ordinances as a compliance officer. No one suspected him, not his wife, not his children, not his neighbors, not the people who sat next to him in the pews every Sunday. For 13 years, Dennis Rader lived a double life, keeping his secrets locked away, until something shifted in 2004. Perhaps it was the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders that brought media attention back to the case. Perhaps it was the publication of a book about BTK that didn't give him the credit he thought he deserved. Whatever the reason, Rader decided to re-emerge. He began sending letters again, first to the media, then directly to the police. He sent packages containing jewelry taken from victims, drawings, dolls posed in bondage positions. He was playing a game, testing the authorities, seeing how much he could reveal without getting caught. And then he made a mistake. In one of his letters, Rader asked police if it would be safe for him to send communications on a floppy disk. The police, in a move that was part strategy and part gamble, placed an ad in the newspaper assuring him that it would be safe. So in February 2005, Rader sent a floppy disk to a television station. Investigators immediately examined the disk. Deleted files can often be recovered from digital media, and that's exactly what they found. Embedded in the metadata of a deleted document was the name Dennis and a link to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. A quick search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of that congregation. Police obtained a DNA sample from Rader's daughter through a medical record and compared it to DNA recovered from evidence at the crime scenes. It was a familial match. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over while driving near his home and arrested. He offered no resistance. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. In custody, Rader confessed to all 10 murders in meticulous detail. He described his methods, his motivations, his trophies. He spoke about the killings the way someone might describe a hobby. During his court proceedings, he showed no remorse. He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder, and in August 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, the maximum allowed as Kansas did not have the death penalty at the time of his crimes. In court, victims' families confronted him. They spoke of the decades of pain, the lives destroyed, the fear that never went away. Rader listened, stone-faced. When given the opportunity to speak, he offered what sounded more like a presentation than an apology, walking through his crimes with unsettling precision. Today, Dennis Rader remains incarcerated in Kansas, serving his life sentences in solitary confinement. He will never be released. He has given interviews over the years, always seeking attention, always trying to control the narrative. But the control he once wielded is gone. He is simply prisoner, number 0083707, aging in a cell far from the spotlight he once craved. The people of Wichita can finally close a chapter that haunted them for more than 30 years. But the scars remain. For the families who lost loved ones, for the survivors who carry the trauma, and for a city that learned how easily a monster can hide behind the face of a neighbor. Number 5. Lonnie Franklin Jr. The neighborhood of South Los Angeles had been bleeding for decades, but no one seemed to notice. Between 1985 and 2007, women were disappearing from the streets. Women struggling with addiction, women working to survive, women whose absences were often met with silence rather than search parties. Their bodies were found in alleys, dumpsters, and abandoned lots, discarded like they didn't matter. And for years, the pattern went unrecognized. The deaths attributed to the dangers of street life rather than the work of a single killer moving through the community like a shadow. When police finally connected the cases and realized they were hunting a serial killer, they gave him a name that reflected the long gaps between some of the murders, the Grim Sleeper. But he wasn't sleeping. He was hiding in plain sight, living on the same streets where his victims had walked, attending the same neighborhood gatherings, shopping at the same stores. And no one suspected that the friendly mechanic who lived on 81st Street, the man who waved to neighbors and worked on cars in his driveway, was responsible for some of the most brutal crimes in Los Angeles history. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born in 1952 and grew up in South Los Angeles. He joined the Army in the early 1970s and was stationed in Germany, where he worked as a mechanic. After his military service, he returned to Los Angeles, married, and started a family. He had a son and a daughter and settled into what appeared to be a stable working-class life. He worked as a garbage collector for the city, a job he held for years. He was known in his neighborhood as someone who could fix cars, and people would bring their vehicles to him for repairs. He took photographs as a hobby, always carrying a camera, always snapping pictures at parties and gatherings. To those who knew him casually, he seemed harmless, maybe a little rough around the edges, but not dangerous. He had friends. He went to cookouts. He was part of the fabric of the community. But behind closed doors, Lonnie Franklin was someone else entirely. The killings began in the summer of 1985. The first known victim was Deborah Jackson, found shot to death in an alley in South Los Angeles. Then came Henrietta Wright, found in an alley in August. Weeks later, Barbara Ware was discovered in the same area, also shot. By the end of the year, 3 more women had been killed. Thomas Steele, Lacrica Jefferson, and Princess Berthomeu. All were found in similar locations, all shot with the same .25 caliber weapon, all left in positions that suggested they had been discarded without care. The attacks continued into 1986 and 1987. Some victims survived. One woman was shot and left for dead, but managed to crawl to safety and describe her attacker, a black man in his 30s, driving an orange Ford Pinto. But the description was general enough that it didn't lead to any immediate suspects. Then, in 1988, the murders seemed to stop. The killer went dormant, or at least appeared to. What police didn't know at the time was that Franklin hadn't stopped entirely. He had simply become more careful. The so-called sleep period between 1988 and 2002 is what gave him his nickname, but investigators would later discover that the pattern was more complicated than it initially appeared. There were gaps, yes, but there were also questions about other unsolved cases that might have fallen through the cracks. In 2002, the killings resumed. The bodies of women began appearing again in South Los Angeles, Valerie McCorvey, found in 2003, and others in the years that followed. The victims fit the same profile. Vulnerable women, many involved in street-level survival work, many struggling with addiction. The crimes bore the same hallmarks as the 1980s murders, but it would take years before investigators definitively connected them. The breakthrough came in 2008, but not through traditional detective work. A task force had been formed to investigate the string of murders, and they decided to try something unconventional. They organized an event in South Los Angeles, a community gathering offering free food and prizes, and collected DNA samples from attendees by offering them pizza and soda, then discreetly keeping the plates and cups. It was controversial, a tactic that would later be debated in legal circles, but it worked. Among the hundreds of samples collected, one came back as a familial DNA match to evidence found at several of the crime scenes. The match led investigators to Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s son, who had been convicted of a felony and whose DNA was in the system. That connection pointed them directly to Lonnie Franklin himself. Police began surveillance on Franklin, watching him for weeks, documenting his movements, waiting for an opportunity to collect a definitive DNA sample. In July 2010, they got it. Franklin discarded food at a restaurant, and investigators retrieved it. The DNA was tested and matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. On July 7, 2010, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested outside his home on 81st Street. The arrest shocked the neighborhood. People who had known him for years couldn't believe it. His family was devastated. His wife maintained that she had no knowledge of his crimes, and investigators found no evidence to suggest otherwise. When police searched Franklin's home, they found a horrifying trove of evidence. There were hundreds of photographs and videos, images of women in various states of consciousness, some appearing drugged or unconscious, some in positions that suggested they were unaware they were being photographed. Many of the women in the photos have never been identified. Some may have been victims who were never reported missing. Others may have survived encounters with Franklin without ever knowing how close they came to death. Investigators also found a .25 caliber handgun, the same type of weapon used in many of the murders, along with personal items that may have belonged to victims, jewelry, identification cards, small keepsakes that Franklin had kept as trophies. The legal process was long and complicated. Franklin was charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The trial, which began in 2016, was emotionally grueling. Survivors testified about their encounters with Franklin, describing how he had approached them, offered them rides, and then turned violent. Family members of the victims spoke about decades of not knowing, of waiting for answers that never came, of being told their loved ones didn't matter enough for a thorough investigation. Franklin's defense argued that the DNA evidence had been mishandled, that the investigation was flawed, and that the community DNA collection was unconstitutional. But the evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the weapon found in his home to several of the murders. DNA connected him to multiple victims. Survivors identified him, and the photographs found in his house painted a picture of a man who had been hunting women for decades. In May 2016, after deliberating for less than 2 days, the jury found Lonnie Franklin Jr. guilty on all counts. The conviction carried a mandatory sentence of death. On August 10, 2016, Franklin was formally sentenced and sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. But he would never face that execution. On March 28, 2020, while still on death row, Lonnie Franklin Jr. died in his cell. He was 67 years old. The cause of death was not immediately disclosed, but it was reported as being from natural causes. His death brought a measure of closure for some families, but for others, it felt like he had escaped true justice. What remains most haunting about the grim sleeper case is not just the number of victims or the length of time he evaded capture. It's the fact that he was able to operate for so long in a community where people knew him, where he had friends and family, where he was seen as just another neighbor. It's the reality that so many of his victims were overlooked because of who they were. Women's society had failed long before Franklin ever harmed them. Even now, years after his death, investigators continue to work on identifying the women in the photographs found in his home. Some families may still be waiting for answers, not knowing that someone they lost decades ago ended up in the collection of a killer who lived just down the street. Number 6. Israel Keyes. There's a concept in criminal psychology called organized planning, where an offender meticulously prepares for crimes in advance, leaving as little to chance as possible. And then there's what Israel Keyes did, something that went beyond ordinary preparation into a realm that investigators had never quite encountered before. Years before he would commit certain murders, Keyes would travel to remote locations across the United States, dig holes in the wilderness, and bury what he called kill kits, caches containing weapons, tools, zip ties, cash, and everything he might need to abduct and eliminate a victim. He would mark the locations in his memory and then simply leave, sometimes not returning for years. When he finally came back, the kits would be waiting, untraceable, purchased in different states, connected to no one. He was building an infrastructure for murder, and he was doing it with the patience of someone who understood exactly how investigations work and how to stay invisible. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Richmond, Utah, into a family that lived on the fringes of society. His parents were part of a religious community that rejected many aspects of modern life, and the family moved frequently, eventually settling in a remote area of Washington state. Keyes and his siblings were homeschooled, raised in isolation, with little exposure to the outside world. He later described his childhood as disconnected, and as he grew older, that disconnection seemed to deepen into something darker. As a teenager, Keyes began exhibiting troubling behavior, torturing animals, expressing violent fantasies, distancing himself emotionally from others. He joined the Army in 1998 and served for several years, stationed in both the United States and overseas. The military gave him structure, discipline, and training in skills that he would later use in horrifying ways. After his discharge, he moved to Alaska, where he worked as a construction contractor and handyman. He had a daughter with a woman he lived with, and to most people who knew him, he seemed capable, reliable, and quiet. Maybe a little odd, but nothing alarming. He paid his bills. He showed up to jobs on time. He seemed like just another guy trying to make a living in the last frontier. But Israel Keyes was living a double life. He traveled constantly for work, or at least that's what he told people. In reality, many of those trips had nothing to do with construction jobs. He was scouting locations, burying his kill kits, and hunting for victims. He chose people randomly, selecting them based purely on opportunity rather than any personal connection. He believed that by avoiding patterns, by not targeting a specific type of victim, by not staying in one geographic area, by not using the same methods repeatedly, he could commit crimes indefinitely without being caught. And for a long time, he was right. Keyes later confessed to killing at least 11 people, though investigators believe the true number may be higher. He was strategic about his crimes, often traveling thousands of miles from home to commit them, ensuring there would be no connection between him and the victim. He would fly into a city, rent a car using cash or a prepaid card, find a victim, and then leave, sometimes disposing of the body in a completely different location. He didn't leave witnesses. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He was methodical to the point of obsession. One of the few cases where investigators were able to definitively link Keyes to victims was the murders of Bill and Lorraine Currier, a couple from Vermont. In June 2011, Keyes flew across the country, rented a car, and drove to the Currier's home in the middle of the night. He broke in, bound the couple, and forced them into his vehicle. He drove them to an abandoned farmhouse he had scouted earlier, where he killed them both. He disposed of their bodies in a remote location, then returned to Alaska as if nothing had happened. The Curriers were reported missing, but without bodies or clear evidence of foul play, the case went nowhere for months. But it was another crime, one that was less carefully planned, that finally brought Israel Keyes into custody. On February 1st, 2012, 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was working the evening shift at a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. It was a small roadside booth, the kind where customers drive up and order through a window. Just before closing time, a man approached on foot. It was Israel Keyes. He pulled out a weapon, forced Samantha into his truck, and drove away. He took her to a shed on his property, where he held her for several hours before killing her. Then, in a move that was as calculated as it was disturbing, Keyes left Alaska and went on a planned cruise with his girlfriend and daughter as if nothing had happened. When he returned 2 weeks later, he retrieved Samantha's body from the shed, posed it to make it appear she was still alive, and took a photograph, which he planned to use to extort ransom money from her family. He dismembered her body and disposed of it in a frozen lake, then sent the photograph to her family, along with a ransom note demanding money. He believed that by the time anyone realized she was dead, he would be long gone. But he made mistakes. He used Samantha's debit card at ATMs in multiple states, and surveillance footage captured his image. He also used his own vehicle during some of the transactions, and investigators were able to track him through a combination of financial records, surveillance video, and cell phone data. On March 13, 2012, Israel Keyes was arrested in Texas after police spotted his vehicle at a gas station. Initially, he refused to cooperate, but over the following months, as investigators interviewed him repeatedly, he began to talk. He seemed to enjoy the conversations, treating them almost like a game. He would dole out information slowly, offering details about some crimes while withholding others. He admitted to the murders of the Curriers and Samantha Koenig. He described his kill kits and how he had buried them across the country. He talked about his philosophy, his belief that morality was a construct, that he was simply acting on impulses that others were too weak to follow. But he was also manipulative. He would only provide information if investigators met his demands. He wanted certain things kept out of the media, wanted assurances that his daughter would never know what he had done, wanted control over how his story was told. He hinted at other victims, but refused to give names or locations unless his conditions were met. On December 2, 2012, while awaiting trial in an Anchorage jail, Israel Keyes took his own life. He used a razor blade to end his own existence and left behind a note, along with a drawing that investigators interpreted as a symbolic representation of his crimes. His death ended any hope of learning the full extent of what he had done. In the years since, investigators have worked to identify other possible victims. They've searched areas where Keyes admitted to burying bodies, followed up on missing persons cases from cities he visited, and tried to piece together a timeline of his movements. Some cases have been tentatively linked to him, but without confessions or physical evidence, many remain unsolved. The FBI has released information about Keyes' travels and the locations of his kill kits in hopes that the public might provide tips that could help close other cases. But the reality is that much of what Israel Keyes did will likely never be fully known. He designed his crimes specifically to be unsolvable, and in many ways, he succeeded. What makes the case of Israel Keyes so deeply unsettling is not just the brutality of his actions, but the level of forethought involved. This wasn't someone acting impulsively or out of desperation. This was someone who spent years preparing to kill, who traveled thousands of miles to commit crimes, who buried supplies in the wilderness and waited patiently for the right moment. He understood how investigations worked, and he structured his life around avoiding detection, and he almost got away with it. If not for a single mistake, using a victim's debit card, he might still be out there, adding to his hidden cache of victims, moving through the country like a ghost, killing without pattern, without motive, without leaving anything behind but silence. Number 7. Gary Ridgway. The Green River winds through Washington state, cutting through forest and farmland before emptying into Puget Sound. In the early 1980s, it became synonymous with death. Between 1982 and 1984, the bodies of young women began appearing along its banks, in the brush, partially submerged in the water, left in clusters as if the killer was returning to the same dumping grounds again and again. The victims were often runaways, women working the streets of Seattle and nearby areas, women whose disappearances sometimes went unreported for weeks or months. By the time investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer, the body count was already climbing into double digits. They called him the Green River Killer, and for nearly 20 years, he was one of the most wanted fugitives in the United States. Task forces were formed. Thousands of tips poured in. Suspects were interviewed and cleared. Evidence was collected and analyzed with the limited technology available at the time. But the killer remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the sprawl of the Pacific Northwest, continuing to kill even as investigators closed in on leads that went nowhere. Gary Leon Ridgway was born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, but grew up in the Seattle area. His childhood was troubled. His mother was reportedly domineering and abusive, and Ridgway struggled in school, showing signs of learning disabilities and difficulty controlling his impulses. He wet the bed well into his teenage years, a behavior that brought him humiliation and anger. He had a complicated relationship with women from an early age, oscillating between dependence and resentment. He was married and divorced twice before his third marriage in the late 1980s, and by all accounts, he led a life that seemed unremarkable from the outside. He worked as a truck painter at a factory in Renton, Washington, a job he held for over 30 years. He was reliable, showing up on time, doing his work without complaint. His co-workers described him as quiet, maybe a little odd, but not someone who raised red flags. He attended church regularly, read the Bible, and talked openly about his faith. He lived in a modest house, maintained his yard, and seemed to blend seamlessly into suburban life. But Gary Ridgway had a secret life. That began long before the Green River murders. He frequented areas where women worked on the streets, sometimes paying for encounters, other times simply driving around, watching, learning routines and patterns. He knew the areas around SeaTac Airport, the motels along Pacific Highway, the bus stops where women waited for rides. He knew which women were vulnerable, which ones had no family looking for them, which ones could disappear without anyone immediately noticing. The killings began in 1982, though Ridgway would later admit that he had been thinking about it for years before he acted. His method was disturbingly simple. He would approach women, offer them money, drive them to a secluded location, and then strangle them, usually with his bare hands or a ligature. He often had intimate contact with them before killing them, and in some cases, he returned to the bodies afterward to further violate them. He would then dump the bodies in clusters, sometimes in the Green River, sometimes in wooded areas south of Seattle, sometimes along back roads where they might not be discovered for weeks or months. By 1984, the body count was staggering. Dozens of women had been found dead, and many more were missing. The Green River Task Force was formed, one of the most extensive and expensive investigations in U.S. history at that point. Thousands of potential suspects were interviewed, including Gary Ridgway. He was brought in for questioning multiple times in the 1980s and even took a polygraph test in 1984, which he passed. Investigators looked at him, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold him, so he was released. And he kept killing. The murders continued sporadically through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, though the pace seemed to slow. Some investigators believed the killer had moved away, died, or been incarcerated for another crime. Others believed he was simply being more careful. What they didn't know was that Ridgway had gotten married again in 1988, and his new wife seemed to exert a stabilizing influence on him. The killings became less frequent, though they didn't stop entirely. He claimed later that he killed his last victim in 1998, but by then, he had been living a relatively normal life for years, going to work, attending church, spending time with his wife, all while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. The breakthrough came in 2001, not through traditional detective work, but through advancements in DNA technology. Evidence collected from several of the victims in the early 1980s had been preserved, and with new techniques, investigators were able to develop DNA profiles from samples that had been too degraded to analyze before. Those profiles were run through databases, and they matched a sample that had been taken from Gary Ridgway during one of his earlier interviews in 1987. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested at his workplace. He was 62 years old. His co-workers were stunned. His wife was devastated. Neighbors couldn't believe it. The quiet man who painted trucks and went to church was the Green River Killer. Initially, Ridgway was charged with 4 murders, the ones where DNA evidence provided the clearest link. But investigators knew there were many more. They began interrogating him, building rapport, offering him incentives to cooperate. And slowly, Gary Ridgway began to talk. Over the course of months, he confessed to killing 48 women, though he said the actual number might be higher. He had lost count. He described his methods in chilling detail, explaining how he chose his victims, where he took them, how he killed them, and where he disposed of the bodies. He led investigators to remains that had never been found, helping them recover bodies from remote locations that only he knew about. He drew maps. He answered questions. He showed no real remorse, instead describing the murders as something he felt compelled to do, something he couldn't stop. In 2003, prosecutors offered Ridgway a deal. If he confessed to all of his crimes and helped locate victims, they would take the death penalty off the table and sentence him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ridgway accepted. On November 5, 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The sentencing hearings went on for days, with family members of the victims given the opportunity to address him directly. Some spoke of their pain, their anger, their loss. Others simply stared at him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of their words. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences, effectively ensuring he would die in prison. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to an additional murder, bringing his official victim count to 49, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. He remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he spends most of his time, in isolation. Over the years, he has been interviewed multiple times by investigators, prosecutors, and forensic psychologists, all trying to understand what drove him. His answers have been consistent but disturbing. He claimed he killed because he hated the women he targeted, because he saw them as easy victims, because he enjoyed the control it gave him. He showed little understanding of the pain he caused, and when asked about the families of his victims, he seemed puzzled that anyone would care. The Green River Killer case remains one of the most significant in modern criminal history, not only because of the sheer number of victims, but because of how long Ridgway evaded capture. He was interviewed multiple times. He passed a polygraph. He lived openly in the community, working a steady job, maintaining relationships, attending church services. He wasn't a drifter or a loner hiding in the shadows. He was a man who lived in plain sight, who understood how to appear normal, who knew that as long as he targeted the most vulnerable, society wouldn't look too closely. And that's perhaps the most haunting part of his story. Not just that he killed so many, but that for so many years, the world let him. Number 8, Anthony Sowell. The smell had been there for months, maybe even years. Neighbors on Imperial Avenue in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Cleveland had complained about it repeatedly, a thick, nauseating odor that seemed to hang in the air, especially during warm weather. It was the kind of smell that made people gag, that forced them to close their windows even on hot summer days. The city investigated multiple times. They checked the sewers, inspected nearby properties, and eventually blamed it on a sausage factory a few blocks away. The factory denied responsibility, but the explanation seemed to satisfy city officials. The complaints quieted down. People learned to live with it, the way you learn to live with a lot of things in a struggling neighborhood where resources are scarce and attention is hard to come by. No one suspected that the smell was coming from a modest two-story house, from the home of a man neighbors knew as polite and quiet, someone who kept to himself but always said hello. No one imagined that inside that house, on the second and third floors, and in the basement, were the remains of 11 women. Some decomposed beyond recognition, some wrapped in plastic, some simply left where they had fallen. Anthony Sowell was born in 1959 in East Cleveland and grew up in a household marked by poverty and dysfunction. He experienced significant trauma as a child, including reported instances of physical and emotional mistreatment. And by the time he was a teenager, he was already showing signs of violent behavior. He joined the Marines in 1978 and served for several years, receiving an honorable discharge in 1985. But his time in the military didn't stabilize him. Shortly after returning to civilian life, he committed a violent assault against a woman, attacking and choking her. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served his time at a correctional facility in Ohio and was released in 2005 after completing his sentence. As a convicted offender, he was required to register with authorities, and he did so without issue. He moved into the house on Imperial Avenue, a property owned by a family member, and settled into what appeared to be a quiet, unremarkable existence. He collected disability payments, kept to himself, and seemed to be just another face in the neighborhood. If people noticed him at all, it was usually because he was friendly, approachable, someone who would chat on the porch or wave as you walked by. But behind closed doors, Anthony Sowell was hunting. His victims were women from the neighborhood, many of them struggling with addiction, many of them vulnerable and isolated. He would meet them on the street, offer them money or drugs or a place to get out of the cold. They would go back to his house willingly, trusting him, or at least desperate enough to take the risk. And once they were inside, he would attack them, often strangling them in the same way he had attacked the woman who sent him to prison years earlier. He would then leave their bodies in the house, upstairs, in the basement, in crawl spaces, sometimes burying them in shallow graves in his backyard. Between 2007 and 2009, women disappeared from the neighborhood. Families reported them missing, but the cases often didn't receive significant attention. These were women whose lives had been chaotic, whose absences were sometimes explained away as voluntary disappearances or relapses. There were no obvious connections between the missing women, no pattern that suggested a single predator was responsible. The neighborhood continued on, and the smell continued to linger, blamed on industrial sources rather than something far more sinister. The truth came to light on October 29, 2009, in the most unexpected way. A woman named LaTundra Billups went to Sowell's house, and he attacked her, attempting to strangle her. But unlike the others, LaTundra fought back. She managed to escape, running from the house and seeking help. She reported the attack to police, and when officers went to the house on Imperial Avenue to investigate, they knocked on the door and spoke with Sowell. He seemed cooperative, even calm. But as they stood on the porch, the officers noticed the smell, stronger inside the house than anywhere else on the street. They obtained a search warrant and returned the next day. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror. In the upstairs rooms, they discovered multiple bodies in various states of decomposition. In the basement, they found more remains. In the backyard, buried in shallow graves, they uncovered additional victims. In total, 11 women were recovered from the property. Some had been there for months, some for years. The neighborhood was in shock. News crews descended on Imperial Avenue, and residents watched in disbelief as body after body was removed from the house. The smell that had plagued the area for so long suddenly made horrifying sense. The missing women, who had been dismissed as runaways or addicts who had simply moved on, were now confirmed dead. Their remains recovered from a place many had walked past dozens of times. Anthony Sowell was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, along with additional charges including attempted murder, assault, and kidnapping. As investigators dug into his background, they discovered that there had been warning signs. In addition to his previous conviction, there had been other complaints against him over the years, reports of violence, of threatening behavior, but nothing that led to serious consequences. He had been allowed to live in the community, to move freely, to continue targeting vulnerable women. The trial began in 2011 and was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Survivors testified about their encounters with Sowell, describing how he had lured them into his home and attacked them. Families of the victims spoke about years of not knowing, of searching for loved ones, of being told by authorities that their family members probably didn't want to be found. Forensic experts detailed the conditions of the remains, the timeline of the deaths, the evidence that linked Sowell to each victim. Sowell's defense attempted to argue that he was mentally ill, that his traumatic childhood and psychological issues should be considered as mitigating factors. But the evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked him to the victims. Survivors identified him. The sheer number of bodies found in his home left no room for reasonable doubt. On August 10, 2011, after several weeks of testimony, the jury found Anthony Sowell guilty on all counts, 11 counts of murder, along with dozens of additional charges related to kidnapping, assault, and tampering with evidence. The trial moved to the penalty phase, where the jury had to decide whether Sowell should receive the death penalty or life in prison. After deliberation, they recommended death. On August 12, 2011, the judge sentenced Anthony Sowell to death. He was sent to the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio to await execution. For years, he remained on death row, appealing his conviction, filing motions, trying to delay the inevitable. But the appeals were consistently denied. The evidence was too strong. The case was too clear. On February 8, 2021, while still on death row, Anthony Sowell became ill. He was taken to a hospital in Franklin County, where he died shortly after. He was 61 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a terminal illness. He never faced execution. He never expressed genuine remorse. And in the end, he died without giving full answers to the families who wanted to know why. Why their daughters, sisters, and mothers had been chosen. Why they had suffered. Why no one had stopped him sooner. The case of Anthony Sowell raised difficult questions that the city of Cleveland is still grappling with. How did so many women disappear from the same neighborhood without anyone connecting the cases? Why were the missing persons reports not investigated more thoroughly? Why was the smell blamed on a factory instead of properly investigated? And why was a man with a history of violent attacks against women allowed to live in the community without more stringent oversight? The families of the victims have spoken publicly about these failures, about how their loved ones were dismissed because of who they were, because they were struggling, because they didn't fit the profile of victims that society deems worthy of urgent attention. The Imperial Avenue case became a symbol of systemic neglect, of how easily people can fall through the cracks when the system decides they don't matter. Today, the house on Imperial Avenue is gone. It was demolished in 2011, torn down and turned into an empty lot. The neighborhood has tried to move on, but the memory remains. 11 women lost their lives in that house, and for years their deaths went unnoticed, hidden behind a smell that everyone could sense, but no one truly investigated. And that, more than anything, is what haunts the people who lived there. The knowledge that the answer was right in front of them all along, if only someone had been willing to look. Number 9. Charles Cullen. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, sanctuaries where the sick go to recover, and the dying find comfort in their final moments. Families trust that when they leave a loved one in the care of medical professionals, those professionals will do everything in their power to preserve life. But for nearly 16 years, Across 9 hospitals and 1 nursing home in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, a nurse moved quietly through the night shifts, slipping into patients' rooms with syringes filled with medications that would stop hearts, induce organ failure, and bring death where there should have been recovery. Charles Cullen wasn't a mercy killer who claimed to be ending suffering. He wasn't motivated by financial gain or personal vendettas against his victims. He killed, by his own later admission, because of what he called feelings, overwhelming urges that would build inside him until he acted, delivering lethal doses of digoxin, insulin, and other drugs to patients who had no idea they were in danger. And because he was a nurse, because he had access and opportunity, and because the healthcare system failed repeatedly to stop him, he was able to continue for over a decade and a half, leaving behind a death toll that investigators believe could be as high as 400 victims. Charles Edmund Cullen was born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children. His childhood was marked by tragedy and instability. His father died when Cullen was just 7 months old, and his mother passed away when he was a teenager. He struggled emotionally throughout his youth, and by the time he was in high school, he had already attempted to take his own life multiple times. He dropped out of school, joined the Navy in 1978, and served on a submarine. But his mental health continued to deteriorate, and after several more attempts to harm himself, he was discharged in 1984. Despite his troubled history, Cullen was able to enroll in nursing school, and in 1987, he became a licensed practical nurse. He found work easily. There was always a demand for nurses willing to work night shifts, and Cullen seemed reliable, competent, and willing to take on the less desirable hours. He worked at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, starting in 1988, and it was there that his killing appears to have begun. His method was insidious in its simplicity. He would access medication storage areas, often without proper authorization, and withdraw drugs that could be lethal in high doses, particularly digoxin, a heart medication that in excessive amounts causes cardiac arrest, and insulin, which can induce fatal hypoglycemia. He would then administer these drugs to patients through their intravenous lines, often during the quiet hours of the night when oversight was minimal. The patients would go into distress, sometimes dying quickly, other times lingering in a deteriorating state before passing away. Because they were already ill, because they were in a hospital where unexpected declines can happen, the deaths often didn't raise immediate suspicion. But there were signs. At St. Barnabas, colleagues noticed that patients seemed to go into cardiac arrest more frequently when Cullen was on duty. There were whispers, concerns raised in hushed conversations, but nothing concrete enough to trigger a formal investigation. In 1992, after a patient's death raised questions, hospital administrators took the unusual step of essentially forcing Cullen to resign. Though no criminal charges were filed and no report was made to law enforcement or nursing boards that might have prevented him from working elsewhere. And so Charles Cullen simply moved on. He took a job at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where the killing continued. Then he moved to Hunterdon Medical Center, then to Morristown Memorial Hospital, then to Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, then to Easton Hospital in Pennsylvania. At nearly every facility, there were red flags, unexplained patient deaths, medication discrepancies, concerns raised by co-workers. At some facilities, administrators conducted quiet internal investigations and allowed Cullen to resign rather than face formal consequences. At others, they simply let him go without explanation, providing neutral references that allowed him to find work at the next hospital. The pattern was consistent and devastating. Cullen would start at a new facility, work for months or sometimes years, and patients would die under mysterious circumstances. When questions were raised, he would resign or be quietly pushed out, and he would move to another hospital, where the cycle would begin again. The healthcare system, either through negligence or a desire to avoid liability and scandal, allowed him to continue practicing nursing without ever alerting authorities or other potential employers about the concerns that had been raised. The pattern finally broke in 2003 at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. Hospital administrators noticed unusual patterns in medication orders and began investigating. They discovered that Cullen had been accessing drugs he had no authorization to handle, and that several patients had died unexpectedly after receiving medications they weren't prescribed. This time, instead of simply letting him go, the hospital contacted law enforcement. Detectives began surveillance on Cullen, and on December 12, 2003, he was arrested. Initially, he denied everything, but as investigators presented evidence, medication logs, testimony from co-workers, patterns of patient deaths that corresponded with his shifts, he began to crack. On December 14th, during an interrogation, Charles Cullen confessed. He admitted to killing patients, though he claimed he couldn't remember exactly how many. He said he had been doing it for years, across multiple hospitals, and that he had felt compelled to do it, driven by urges he couldn't control. Over the following weeks and months, investigators worked to verify his confessions and determine the full scope of his crimes. It was a monumental task. Patient records had to be reviewed, toxicology reports examined, and patterns analyzed across nearly 2 decades and multiple facilities. Cullen eventually confessed to killing at least 40 patients, though he indicated the number could be much higher. Investigators believe that based on suspicious patient deaths during his shifts and evidence of medication tampering, the true victim count could be in the hundreds, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in American history. The legal process was complicated by the sheer number of jurisdictions involved and the difficulty of prosecuting decades-old cases. In 2004, Cullen agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for cooperating with investigators and providing information about his crimes, he would receive multiple life sentences instead of the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to murdering 29 patients and attempting to murder 2 others across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. On March 10, 2006, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole. Additional sentences followed in Pennsylvania and other New Jersey counties, each adding more life terms to a sentence that was already effectively endless. During the sentencing hearings, families of the victims confronted Cullen, expressing their anguish and anger. Many had trusted the hospitals with their loved ones, believing they were receiving the best possible care, never imagining that a nurse was intentionally ending their lives. Some victims were elderly patients who might have recovered and gone home. Others were younger, with years of life ahead of them. All of them were killed by someone they had no reason to fear. The case also sparked outrage at the healthcare institutions that had employed Cullen. Investigations revealed that multiple hospitals had suspected him of wrongdoing, but had failed to report him to authorities or to state nursing boards. Some had even provided positive or neutral references when he applied for jobs elsewhere, essentially passing the problem along rather than confronting it. Lawsuits were filed by victims' families, and some hospitals reached settlements, though no amount of money could undo the damage or bring back the lives lost. Charles Cullen remains incarcerated at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. He spends most of his time in protective custody, isolated from the general population. Over the years, he has given occasional interviews, speaking in vague terms about his motivations, describing feelings of depression and self-loathing, but never offering a clear explanation for why he killed. He has expressed what he describes as remorse, though to many, his words ring hollow given the magnitude of his actions. The case led to significant changes in how hospitals handle suspicious deaths and employee misconduct. There are now stricter protocols for medication access, enhanced monitoring of patient outcomes, and mandatory reporting requirements when healthcare workers are suspected of harming patients. But these changes came too late for the dozens, possibly hundreds, of people who died at the hands of Charles Cullen. What makes his story so deeply unsettling is not just the number of victims, but the institutional failures that allowed it to continue for so long. Hospital after hospital had concerns, had evidence, had opportunities to stop him, and instead, they let him walk out the door and into another facility where he could continue killing. It was a systemic failure driven by fear of lawsuits, desire to avoid bad publicity, and a willingness to prioritize institutional reputation over patient safety. And somewhere in that failure, in those years of silence and missed opportunities, hundreds of families lost people they loved, not to illness, not to natural causes, but to a man who walked the halls in scrubs, trusted with the power to heal, and chose instead to kill. Number 10. Todd Kohlhepp. The text message was brief, almost casual. Help me. It came from a phone that had been silent for weeks, a phone that belonged to a woman named Kayla Brown, who had disappeared in late August, along with her boyfriend, Charlie Carver. The two had gone to a property in rural South Carolina to do some work for a client, and they were never seen again. For months, their families searched, posted flyers, pleaded on social media, and filed missing persons reports. The police investigated, but found no solid leads. The case seemed destined to go cold, another unsolved disappearance in a sprawling rural area where people can vanish without a trace. But on November 3rd, 2016, that text message changed everything. Investigators were able to trace the phone signal to a property in Woodruff, South Carolina, a 100-acre lot owned by a local real estate agent named Todd Kohlhepp. When deputies arrived and began searching the property, they heard something that made their blood run cold. A woman's voice, muffled and desperate, calling for help from somewhere they couldn't immediately see. They followed the sound to a large metal shipping container on the property, the kind used for storage on construction sites. It was locked with a heavy chain. When they cut through the lock and pulled open the door, they found Kayla Brown inside, chained by the neck to the wall, terrified, malnourished, but alive. She had been held captive for 2 months, and when they asked her where Charlie was, her answer confirmed what investigators had begun to fear. He's dead. Todd killed him. Todd Christopher Samsel was born in 1971 in Florida and later took the surname Kohlhepp. His childhood was marked by severe dysfunction and violence. His parents divorced when he was young, and he lived primarily with his mother in South Carolina and Georgia. By the time he was a teenager, he was already exhibiting deeply disturbing behavior. In 1986, at the age of 15, he kidnapped a 14-year-old girl at gunpoint, took her to his home, bound her, and committed a violent assault. He was arrested, tried as an adult, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 14 years in various facilities and was released in 2001. Despite his violent criminal history, he was able to build what appeared to be a successful life. He earned a college degree while incarcerated, and after his release, he obtained a real estate license in South Carolina. He started his own real estate company, bought properties, and began accumulating wealth. He presented himself as a hard-working entrepreneur, someone who had turned his life around despite a troubled past. He owned multiple properties, drove expensive cars, and seemed to be living the American success story. But beneath that polished exterior, Todd Kohlhepp was harboring violent fantasies and, as it would later be revealed, acting on them in ways that no one suspected. After Kayla Brown was rescued and began to tell her story, investigators started piecing together a timeline that was far more horrifying than they had initially imagined. Kayla explained that she and Charlie had been hired by Kohlhepp to help clear some brush and do landscaping work on his property. On August 31st, 2016, they drove to the property together. Shortly after they arrived, Kohlhepp shot and killed Charlie, then forced Kayla into the shipping container, where he chained her and held her captive for the next 2 months. He would visit periodically, bringing her minimal food and water, but otherwise leaving her alone in the dark, metal box, uncertain if she would ever be found. As investigators searched the property, they made another grim discovery. Buried on the land were the remains of 2 more individuals, Johnny Joe Coxey and Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, a couple who had gone missing in December 2015. Kohlhepp had killed them as well and buried their bodies on his property, where they remained hidden for nearly a year. But the investigation didn't stop there. During interrogations, Kohlhepp began talking about other crimes, including one that had haunted the community of Spartanburg, South Carolina, for over a decade. In November 2003, 4 people were shot and killed inside the Superbike motorsports shop in Chesney. Scott Ponder, the shop's owner, Brian Lucas, a service manager, Beverly Guy, the bookkeeper, and Chris Sherbert, a mechanic. The murders were brutal and seemingly execution style, and despite a lengthy investigation, no suspects had ever been charged. The case had gone cold, leaving the families of the victims without answers. Now, 13 years later, Todd Kohlhepp confessed to the murders. He claimed he had gone to the shop to complain about a motorcycle he had purchased and felt he had been treated disrespectfully. In retaliation, he returned with a weapon and killed everyone inside. It was a stunning admission, and investigators scrambled to verify his claims. Details he provided matched evidence from the scene, and ballistics analysis supported his confession. The Superbike motorsports case, long thought unsolved, was suddenly closed. In total, Todd Kohlhepp confessed to 7 murders. The legal process moved quickly, facing overwhelming evidence, including his own confessions, physical evidence from his property, and the testimony of Carla Brown. Kohlhepp agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to all charges, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. On May 26, 2017, Todd Kohlhepp stood in a South Carolina courtroom and pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of criminal assault. The judge sentenced him to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. During the sentencing, families of the victims were given the opportunity to speak. They described years of not knowing, of living with unanswered questions, of wondering if justice would ever come. For the families of the Superbike motorsports victims, the resolution was bittersweet. They finally had answers, but it had taken 13 years, and the person responsible had been living freely all that time, building a business, accumulating wealth, and killing again. Carla Brown also spoke, describing the trauma of her captivity, the fear she lived with every day, and the relief of being rescued. She has since worked to rebuild her life, though the scars of what she endured remain. Todd Kohlhepp is currently incarcerated at the Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina. He remains in protective custody, isolated from the general prison population. Since his incarceration, he has given occasional interviews, speaking about his crimes in disturbingly detached terms, often showing more interest in correcting perceived inaccuracies in media coverage than expressing genuine remorse. He has claimed there may be additional victims, hinting at other crimes, but investigators have been unable to verify these claims, and many believe he is simply seeking attention. The case of Todd Kohlhepp raises troubling questions about the criminal justice system and how individuals with violent histories are monitored after their release. Despite serving 14 years for a brutal attack as a teenager, despite being classified as a convicted offender, Kohlhepp was able to obtain a real estate license, own property, and operate a business without raising significant red flags. The system that was supposed to protect the public allowed him to reintegrate into society, and he used that freedom to kill. It also highlights how easily predators can hide in plain sight. Todd Kohlhepp wasn't living in isolation or operating in the shadows. He was a visible member of the community, a businessman with clients and properties, someone people interacted with regularly. He posted online, wrote reviews, and maintained a public persona. And all the while, he was holding a woman captive in a shipping container on his property, standing over the graves of people he had killed and living as though none of it mattered. For the people of South Carolina, particularly those in Spartanburg and the surrounding areas, the Kohlhepp case was a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always fit the profile we expect. Sometimes it wears a suit, sells real estate, and smiles while shaking your hand. And sometimes it takes a desperate text message from a woman chained in the dark to finally bring it into the light.